say to us, well, what do you do in the winter? And we say, oh, some of us go outside. And they kind of look at us, you mean in the snow? And we say, no, terms. But the rec center, when they were building it, they brought in outside engineers. They said, oh, this ground's fine, that's, whatever. So they were going to do an artificial skating rink, artificial ice for curling, you name it, it was going in there. And very soon, the ground started to submerge. And then, of course, all the know-it-alls in Dawson said, well, if we built there, we knew the ground was unsafe, and if you dig down far enough, you'll get water. Dawson originally, they call it a moose pasture. It's a bit more than that. From over the millennia, the sand from the river just building up. So
and there's the permafrost. If they disturb the permafrost, there are huge wedges of ice in the ground that are frozen year-round and have been that way for thousands of years. But when you build on top of that, the heat dispersion will upset the equilibrium, and all of a sudden those wedges of ice turn into water and everything just caves in. So that's a big problem.
And if you go to Dawson today, there's the odd building. Nobody's in the buildings, but they're known as the leaning buildings. They've been cribbed inside because Parks Canada owns them, but they lean very distinctly like this.
So it's sort of intimidating for Scorsese to come there.
But if someone wanted to come and fish those reels out of the river, we learned that some, what were they, lobster fishermen?
There's a tale just this summer that emerged that a lobster fisherman off the coast of Iceland retrieved a Russian film from the 70s. So I guess stranger things have happened.
And Dawson City is incredibly well known for people dismantling buildings and finding old newspapers, even more glass plate negatives. When the St. Mary's Hospital was still standing, the sisters would send their staff out to the gold fields when they heard that this building or that building was being torn down. And if they found glass plate negatives out there, they wanted them definitely for their greenhouses.
Oh yeah, that's what we haven't really touched on that story. That was one of the great discoveries of this film, I thought, because of that story about the glass plate negative, the negatives that were found in the cabin. That was repeated twice, but with absolutely no specifics or detail. It was on the NFB site. The Colin Lowe wrote about some plates that were found in a cabin, and in the foreword to Ethel Anderson Becker's Klondike 98, she said that there were 2,000 plates that were found in a, and so I called up Kathy and said, look, there's these two discrepancies. I can't include it in the film without a date, without a person, with, I'd love to include this story, but it just seems like I'm repeating a lie or an exaggeration, and I guess you can continue from there.
Yeah, so that most of the old-timers that were born and raised in Dawson have unfortunately passed on, so their knowledge is no longer there to tap. But I knew of one lady, and she moved to Whitehorse to be closer to family. So I called her up one day and I said, do you think your memory can go back this far? And I described the story, and there was a little chuckle at the end of it, and she said, yeah, I was that clerk. And it was my husband-to-be and they acquired the cabin, not all cabins are log, and they decided they wanted a honeymoon cabin. So they were going to dismantle it. They took it out of town to a place called Rock Creek and rebuild it. She said the cabin's still standing, people are still living in it. So I asked her how many glass plates she had dug up, and we said the story is 2,000. She said, no, more like 200. She thought they got $100 from Dick Diment, their jeweler, whom she worked for. He was her employer. And then we phoned Diment's son, and he gave us another addition to the story. And then we started hearing about other glass plates that had been found in Dawson. And we said we have to quit here, otherwise that's a whole new film for Bill to start working on.
So there's strange things done And there's strange things found in the Klondike, and it's just these strange coincidences that led to the images that ended up in Ottawa that inspired Colin Lowe,
City of Gold.
City of Gold, which has become a classic film.
In turn, inspired Ken Burns.
That's right.
Well, anyway, we were very proud that we were the first people to be able to identify and, accurately number and have traced how those plates got back to Ottawa, because it had always been shrouded in mystery.
Questions?
Yes, this is a question for Bill and maybe Alex. This is not a traditional documentary. It's this is informed by I think early experimental films like Bruce Conner and George Landau, as it is by documentary. I just wanted to see if you could talk a little about the static development of this film and how you envisioned this to look, and what the dialogue is with art film and documentary, and what this really is for you.
Well, I didn't want to make a straight documentary. I don't think I could make a straight documentary. Yet I thought that this was such an important story, and even if I wanted to cut corners, these two weren't going to let me. So I had to get the story correct. And they were sort of sitting there on my shoulder, and then became incredible allies. At one point, really looking through every issue of the Dawson Daily News for any news of the film find, and really solidifying the center of the film when we find those two incredible headlines about Fred Elliott first dumping the silence in the river and then setting them on fire. And Kathy found those, I believe, in July, right?
It was, Bill had told us he was getting the film ready to show in Venice. So I assumed it was done, but I just sent an email saying, hold the presses. And told him what I had and sent just rough copies, and Michael did the work on them so that they could be used by Bill. So.
The kind of thing that makes you pull your hair out, doesn't it?
But I mean, to answer your question, George, it had, I was obviously relying on a chronological structure, and that I sort of had faith that if I stuck to a chronological structure, all the themes would just resurface as they do, as like film coming up through the ice. It would that I would be able to keep juggling all these things and keep all these balls in the air. And with any piece of this magnitude, you just have to think of it as a jigsaw puzzle, and you try to fill in the edges first, and then shapes that and you have groupings of colors that go together, and eventually you can get to a point where you're putting those last jigsaw puzzles in, and that was what that was with those two headlines. And then really, it was just such a masterful job that Alex and John did in making these different stories, and all the interlocking scenes segue into different moods and different tunes. It was, he would sometimes, I would think a chapter would be starting and finishing here, and he would create it so that it started and finished somewhere else, and it would be a revelation to me. But so we really were collaborators in the narrative that way.
Questions? Way in the back, please.
I'll ask another one. Are you aware of any sort of scholarly debates or whatever that have been resolved by this material? I mean, you said it's all been cataloged and who's there, but there's film historians have arguments about things that these might resolve.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible. I think that if you do have it's worth examining the catalog and the collection. I still feel like it hasn't been very well investigated what's in there. But I guess the one thing that we kind of take credit for finding here is the Black Sox story. That was that sequence where it's the failed double play was upheld in court as an example of how the White Sox were trying to lose the series. This was testimony referred to this play, and of course, nobody knew that there was film of it still sitting around, that it was, you know, in the swimming pool, let alone that it had been archived and cataloged and was sitting in an archive in Ottawa for the last 38 years. So, I led off with it because very early on we found that piece, and being a White Sox fan, I was thrilled. Also to find the 1917 series where they beat the Giants. I hate to say it, but I was happy about that one too. And but the Black Sox series, of course, is one of the great American sports stories, and it just rippled through, the baseball world and the film archive world, and Library and Archives Canada quickly put a copy of it up on YouTube, and it got 350,000 hits overnight, and it probably has 350,001 hits by now. But I think everybody who wanted to see it saw it immediately. And it led to I was doing a lot of baseball interviews. All of a sudden, everyone thought I was making a baseball movie. I was like, I'm not making a baseball movie. Then it sort of culminated with getting called on to Mad Dog's show, which was, you can tell my bemused expression.
That's such a great way to open the movie, because then you immediately wonder, how did we get there?
I'd just like to give credit to my good friend Elizabeth Felicella, who's in the audience, and I had been telling a very straight narrative film and sticking to my guns and starting with the very oldest and going up to the very most recent, building layers of time and that were evident through the different types of media, through the glass plate negatives, through the nitrate, through the safety film and the home movies and the bad video of the 70s, and then of course this digital video of the internet age. And that's how I ended with it, but it wasn't quite right. Of course I needed to end with that wonderful dancer. That was clear that was my outshot, and so I had cut all that stuff after the films left Dawson out of the edit, and I think the same weekend I was sending the film finally. I actually had already sent it to Venice, and I was showing it to Elizabeth, and she said, well, what else do you got? And I said, well, there's this baseball shot. And she was like, well, that should be at the beginning, and then put the pink lady after that. And I was like, well, of course. So, and the pink lady, it's Sourdough Sue, I guess. These two, of course, knew in Dawson City, and it's compelling that she goes, well, I know about the silent films. I'm 66, Of course, we're acutely aware that nobody who's 66 today has any recollection of silent films. So there is this sense that this knowledge is held by living people, and that that knowledge is, a lot of it can die with them, and the same way John Gould knew that the films were bubbling underneath the ice, but nobody else knew, and these guys know an incredible amount about the territory, and I just feel really privileged that I was able to extract some of their knowledge and put it in this film, and that this can outlive us all.
I'd like to look at it from the other perspective and say that we've been involved in a number of projects over the years where they've really brutalized the history for the sake of commercialism or just to appeal to the public.
They being Hollywood, and they being more recently Sir Ridley Scott, who said his Gold Rush three-part was well-researched, very accurate history, and they even put cameras in Dawson City when they were showing them on the TV. And if you were in Times Square, same time in January, you would have seen the Dawson City people all decked out in '98 costumes, many trying hard not to laugh at the terrible gaffes in the film. They had, they had what appeared to be a typical movie Apaches on the hilltops, dressed as such, and they called them Tlingit, whereas the Dawson First Nations are not called Tlingit.
This is why it was so intimidating to me.
On the other hand,
Ridley Scott didn't get it right.
on the other hand, Bill took this challenge, and we really felt that he did a commendable job of putting it together and getting the story right, and we really appreciate that.
Yeah, we both do.